The sky above Earth was calm. The distant stars twinkled in the blackness of space, and the blue planet slowly turned on its axis. To anyone watching from far away, it might have seemed peaceful, even beautiful. But on the ground, the people of Earth were far from peaceful. They were scared. Tension hung in the air, thick and heavy. It was the calm before the storm. For months, Earth had been under attack. The enemy had come from beyond the stars, their ships dark and menacing, blocking out the sun. They were unlike anything humanity had ever seen, huge, powerful, and relentless. At first, the Earth's defenses had held strong, but they were only temporary. Humanity had fought back with everything they had, but the enemy kept coming, always advancing, always pressing forward. Earth's leaders were desperate. They knew they couldn't win. They knew they couldn't stop the endless wave of invaders. Most of the armies were defeated, and the world's strongest nations had fallen. The last line of defense was hanging on by a thread. There were no new weapons, no new plans. There was only hope, a hope that felt more and more like a distant memory. On the streets of every major city, people huddled in fear. The great buildings of civilization were now just places to hide from the bombs falling from the sky. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, and the once bustling cities had become ghost towns. Families clung together in shelters, hiding in basements, desperate to stay out of sight. The world felt like it was dying. The enemy's ships hovered over the planet, blocking the sun, casting a shadow over the Earth that seemed impossible to escape. In the final strongholds, humanity tried to hold its ground, but their forces were stretched thin. They were tired. The weapons they used to fight back were old, outdated. Nothing seemed to work. The people who had once been full of pride and strength now seemed broken. There was no clear command, no clear plan, just scattered forces trying to fight off an unstoppable enemy. The soldiers on the front lines didn't know what they were fighting for anymore. Was there even a chance to survive? But not everyone had given up. In the shadows, away from the sight of the enemy, there were a few people who refused to accept defeat. These were the survivors, the ones who had been overlooked, the ones who had been written off by the world. They didn't have the strength of armies or the power of advanced weapons, but they had something more powerful: the will to fight. In secret underground bases, scattered across the remains of the world, small groups of humans worked tirelessly. They were the last hope. The scientists, engineers, and soldiers who had been hidden away from the enemy, crafting plans and weapons that the invaders couldn't even imagine. These were the people who believed that humanity wasn't done. They knew that Earth had a power that the invaders didn't understand, an inner strength that had been overlooked by those who thought they had already won. On the surface, it seemed like the enemy was on the brink of victory. Their ships circled above, their forces on the ground pushing forward. They thought that Earth was broken, that humanity had given up. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what was being prepared in the dark corners of the planet. A strange signal had been detected, one that the invaders couldn't trace. It came from the farthest corners of Earth, from a hidden underground lab, where the last of humanity's engineers worked without rest. They had discovered something that could change everything, something that could give Earth a chance to fight back. It was a weapon, but not just any weapon. This one was unlike anything the invaders had ever seen. It was ancient and new at the same time, a symbol of humanity's defiance, and it was nearly ready. The problem was that no one knew if it would work. The weapon was still unfinished, and the risks of using it were unknown. It was a gamble, a desperate bet that humanity's last hope could turn the tide of the war. But if they didn't try, they were certain to lose. There was no other option. Back on the surface, the world waited. The people knew that something had to change. They had heard whispers of the secret weapon, but no one knew for sure if it would work. All they could do was hope, as the enemy prepared for the final strike. They waited for a sign, for something to happen that would tell them they weren't alone in this fight. They waited for a miracle. The enemy continued to press forward. Their forces were growing stronger, and Earth's defenses were growing weaker. But amidst the despair, a tiny spark of hope was beginning to grow. The calm was about to break. Somewhere deep underground, the final pieces of humanity's secret weapon were coming together. The invaders had no idea what was coming. They thought they had already won. They thought humanity was finished. But what they didn't know was that humanity wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The storm was coming. And when it hit, the enemy would never expect it. The invaders were certain of their victory. Their massive fleet hovered above Earth, casting long shadows over the planet. For weeks, they had watched humanity crumble, city by city, nation by nation. They had expected resistance at first, but it was feeble, weak, and disorganized. Earth's defense forces had been scattered, their weapons outdated and useless. Slowly, one by one, the great cities fell, and the enemy tightened their grip on the planet. To the invaders, it had been a simple conquest. They had taken down the Earth's armies with ease, using their advanced technology to sweep across the skies and destroy everything in their path. Their ships, sleek and terrifying, were a sign of their power. They had no doubt that humanity would soon be nothing more than a memory. The enemy's leaders spoke in confident tones, already planning their next steps, how they would divide Earth's resources, how they would govern the planet. In their eyes, the fight was over before it had even begun. But what they didn't know was that the humans were far from defeated. The enemy couldn't understand it. How could these primitive creatures still resist? How could they keep fighting back with such little power? The invaders had already wiped out Earth's armies, they had destroyed the cities, and they had crushed any sign of rebellion. Yet, there were whispers of something else, something the enemy couldn't see or hear. Something brewing in the shadows. Humanity had been forced to hide in the deepest corners of the earth, in the forgotten places where no one thought to look. These hidden survivors had seen the enemy for what they were, invaders, but also arrogant. The enemy believed their superiority made them invincible. They believed that because they had advanced technology and superior firepower, they had nothing to fear from a broken, divided world like Earth. What they failed to realize was the one thing they overlooked: the spirit of humanity. In secret, in the places where no enemy drone could reach, humanity had been quietly regrouping. Scientists, engineers, and former soldiers had gone into hiding, bringing together whatever scraps of technology they could salvage. Their goal wasn't just survival, it was revenge. They were building something new, something the enemy had never expected. It wasn't a weapon of mass destruction, like the ones the invaders used. It wasn't something that could be easily understood or anticipated. No, what humanity was building was far more dangerous. A weapon born of ingenuity, desperation, and sheer willpower. The invaders had no idea this was happening. They continued their advance, thinking that victory was inevitable. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, as many had done before them. To the enemy, Earth was just another planet to conquer, just another world to subjugate. But what they didn't know was that the people of Earth had one thing they could never replicate: the unbreakable spirit that had carried them through wars, famines, and countless struggles throughout history. As the enemy tightened their hold on Earth's major cities, a small, determined group of survivors were already making their move. These weren't soldiers or generals. They were ordinary people who had refused to give up. They weren't part of any military, but they had something even more powerful: the belief that their world wasn't lost. These individuals, engineers, hackers, and scientists, had come together in secret, working with whatever they could find. They built a weapon that would change everything. They worked day and night, in underground bunkers, hidden away from prying eyes. Their lab was a mess of wires, old technology, and blueprints that made no sense to anyone outside their group. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And that was enough. Every day, they saw the world around them falling apart. But that only fueled their determination to finish what they had started. Their weapon wasn't designed to destroy cities or erase armies. It was something far more subtle, far more dangerous. The invaders had no idea that, deep below their feet, Humanity was crafting the key to their downfall. It wasn't a weapon of brute force, but one of precise power. A power that would strike when the enemy least expected it. At the surface, the people of Earth had begun to lose hope. News of humanity's scattered resistance had spread, but it was always followed by stories of defeat. The great cities were silent now, their once proud skyscrapers reduced to rubble. The skies were darkened by the invaders' ships, their drones constantly scanning for any remaining human life. Humanity's strongest forces were already beaten. The last pockets of resistance were struggling, their messages of hope fading into the static of the radio waves. But amidst all the despair, the survivors below the surface continued to work. They were making progress, and every day they grew closer to finishing what they had started. The invaders, so confident in their victory, had no idea that the real battle was just beginning. It wasn't about the weapons they had. They were nothing compared to what humanity was about to unleash, and when the time came, the invaders would finally learn that the true strength of humanity was not in its technology, but in its will to survive. The calm before the storm was over. The enemy had no idea what was coming, and they wouldn't be prepared for it when it arrived. They had thought they had already won, but humanity had other plans, and those plans were about to unfold in ways the invaders could never have imagined. The invaders were getting comfortable. They had underestimated the Earth's defenses at first, but now they were certain their victory was within grasp. The planet had been ravaged by their forces, and the few remaining pockets of resistance had been pushed to the edge. Their ships hovered in the skies like a constant reminder of humanity's impending doom. The enemy was now firmly in control, or so they thought. But beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding, one that no one, not even the most brilliant minds in the invader fleet, could foresee. Earth's last hope wasn't in the hands of a military general or a world leader. It wasn't in the form of a great army. It was in the hands of a small, dedicated group of survivors who refused to accept defeat. They had seen what had happened to their world, and rather than surrender, they had chosen to fight. These survivors had been the ones overlooked by the enemy. They were ordinary people without the military training or advanced weaponry the invaders expected. Yet they had something that the invaders couldn't measure, something that no technology or weapons could replicate, an unyielding belief in humanity's ability to rise above any challenge. Deep underground, hidden from the eyes of the enemy, they worked tirelessly. The survivors were a mix of engineers, hackers, and scientists who had been trained to build, fix, and survive. They weren't soldiers, but they understood that sometimes the greatest weapons were the ones that weren't visible. Their project was kept a secret from even the few remaining Earth commanders who hadn't been captured. If the enemy learned what they were doing, everything would be lost. The survivors had found a way to repurpose old technology, scavenging what was left from the wreckage of the old world. They had torn apart abandoned machines and weapons, piecing them together to create something entirely new, something the invaders had no concept of. The weapon they were building wasn't a massive cannon or a super-powered bomb. It was something much more subtle, far more dangerous. It was a weapon that could strike at the heart of the enemy's arrogance without them ever seeing it coming. Day by day, the survivors worked in the shadows, building the device that could turn the tide of the war. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of humanity's strength, a manifestation of everything that had kept the species alive through centuries of hardship. Every click of a tool, every soldered wire was a step closer to victory, and every moment of progress made them more certain that their fight wasn't over. They had come to realize something that the invaders had failed to understand. Earth wasn't a world of people who had been defeated. It was a world of people who had survived against all odds. Outside, the situation was growing worse. The skies were dark with enemy ships, their ominous silhouettes filling every corner of the heavens. The invaders had thought they had crushed any hope of resistance, but the survivors' work was happening right beneath their feet. In their relentless drive to conquer, the invaders had forgotten one of humanity's most defining traits: the will to survive. They had no idea that, in the most unexpected of places, Earth's final defense was being created. As the survivors neared completion of their weapon, they began to feel a strange sense of urgency. Time was running out. Every day, the invaders grew closer to wiping out the last remnants of resistance. The survivors knew that they had only one shot. If the weapon failed, Earth would fall. They couldn't afford mistakes. But despite the pressure, there was a sense of unity among them. They worked as one, each individual contributing their knowledge and expertise, driven by the belief that humanity still had a chance. Meanwhile, the enemy's forces continued their advance. They moved through the remaining human settlements, rounding up those who had yet to escape, and leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. The invaders thought they had seen the last of the human resistance. Their scouts reported nothing of value, just the remains of cities and broken spirits. But the enemy never considered the fact that deep beneath the earth, humanity was quietly crafting its most dangerous weapon. The survivors' creation wasn't just about striking the invaders. It was a message. The weapon they had built was designed to remind the invaders that no matter how powerful they were, they would never be able to crush the spirit of Earth's people. It was a weapon of hope, a weapon that would show the enemy that no matter how many cities they destroyed, no matter how many lives they took, humanity would never be erased. The survivors had learned one thing in the darkest hours of their struggle. As long as there was life, there was hope. And as long as there was hope, humanity would never bow to anyone. As the weapon neared its final stage, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The survivors knew that their creation had the potential to turn the tide of the war, but they also understood the risks. They had no idea how the invaders would react when the weapon was deployed, but they knew it had to be done. The Earth's future depended on it. If they didn't act now, the planet and everything on it would be lost forever. With the weapon now ready for its first test, the survivors gathered one last time, ready to launch their plan. There was no turning back. They had worked for this moment, dreamed of it, and fought for it. They would either succeed and reclaim their world, or they would die trying. The enemy, still unaware of what was coming, continued their march forward, thinking their victory was inevitable. But the survivors knew that the real battle had just begun, and it would be the invaders who would soon learn what humanity was truly capable of. Far above Earth's scorched surface, aboard the command vessel of the enemy fleet, Supreme Commander Vale stood before a towering screen. Data streamed endlessly: maps, drone surveillance, intercepted transmissions. From his point of view, everything was under control. Resistance had fallen silent. Cities no longer sent distress calls. Earth, as far as he was concerned, was already conquered. Yet, something felt wrong. There was a strange stillness in the air, not just across the planet, but within the ship itself. Vel couldn't explain it, but he sensed something was about to change. It was as if the silence wasn't surrender. It was a breath being held, a pause before something violent and final. Down below, buried deep beneath what was once a university research center, the survivors made their final preparations. Their weapon, a hybrid of alien tech and human creativity, was finished. It had no name. It wasn't glamorous. It looked like a patched-together mess of wires, processors, and old batteries. But inside it was something new, a pulse generator that could disrupt the invaders' neural-linked technology. Their species relied on synchronization. Every ship, every soldier, even their thoughts were connected through one vast mental network, a hive mind of efficiency and control. But that also made them vulnerable. If one could disturb the signal, even briefly, chaos would follow. That was humanity's gamble. The survivors didn't expect to win the war with this weapon. They only hoped to light a fire, create an opening, inspire others. The pulse wouldn't destroy ships, but it would sever the invaders' connection, just for a few moments. Enough to expose cracks, enough to let humanity roar back into the fight. They called it the Shard, not because it was sharp or deadly, but because it represented a fragment of hope, one last piece of defiance in a broken world. They activated it at midnight. At first, nothing happened. Then, in the black sky above the ruins of New Chicago, the lights on the enemy vessels began to flicker. One by one. A soft, blinking stutter, then total blackout. In the command ship, Vel's screen froze. No data. No telemetry. No signal from the ground. His fleet commanders shouted over one another in confusion. Ships began drifting, weapons inactive. Fighters lost formation. Some plummeted from the sky like dead birds. Others collided midair. And worst of all, he heard voices. Not the usual chorus of the hive mind, but screaming. Panic. Something had invaded their minds. And on the ground, humanity rose. Hidden cells across the globe had been waiting. They didn't know exactly when the signal would come, but when the sky went dark and the enemy ships began to fall, they knew this was the moment. Resistance groups in the forests of South America, the ruins of Beijing, the underground subway networks of Berlin all emerged. They attacked quickly and with fury. Their weapons were crude. Guns built from scrap, EMP grenades, hack drones. But they were precise. They didn't need to win in one day. They just needed to strike when the enemy was weakest. In New Chicago, the survivors who built the Shard watched the chaos unfold. They couldn't believe it had worked. Their weapon had triggered a chain reaction. Total breakdown of enemy control systems. It wouldn't last long, maybe minutes, but already they heard the roar of humanity returning to battle. And then the unexpected happened. A message was broadcast across every hacked screen, radio, and speaker across Earth. A human voice. A girl's voice. Young, calm, unshaken. This is not the end. This is our beginning. You are not alone. Fight. Rise. Humanity lives. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the operation. No one knew who she was. Some say she was a survivor in the bunkers. Others believe she was a digital ghost, an AI created during the early days of the invasion. But her voice ignited something deeper than orders ever could. It became the rallying cry. The invaders, still stunned and cut off from their central command, tried to reorganize. Some activated emergency protocols. Others attempted manual control. But their greatest strength, their unity, had become their greatest weakness. Without the hive, they were confused, slow, and vulnerable. The pulse effect began to fade after 10 minutes. The lights returned on the ships. The drones rebooted. But it was too late. Earth had awakened. Resistance forces had captured key weapons. Civilians had blocked streets. Communications relays were back online. Across the globe, people emerged from hiding, not with fear, but with fury. For the first time since the invasion began, the invaders felt hunted. In the command ship, Vale stared at the reactivated screen. It showed the flickering chaos of his fleet. His voice trembled as he gave his next command, not an order of attack, but of retreat. He had seen this before in other conquests. When a planet awakens with fire in its heart, it's no longer a battlefield, it's a graveyard. But Earth wasn't going to let them leave so easily. Humanity had just tasted the enemy's fear, and they would not stop. Not now. The weapon had done more than disrupt a system. It had shattered the illusion of dominance. It had shown the world that even the most powerful invaders could bleed. And when they bleed, humans don't show mercy. They show thunder. The sky burned with falling wreckage. Enemy ships, once flawless in their synchronized formations, now spiraled out of control, some crashing into mountain ranges, others disappearing in columns of smoke and fire. The world was changing, second by second, and every human watching it unfold knew. This was no longer a story of survival. This was payback. In the shadows of ruined cities, humanity was no longer hiding. In what used to be northern India, a boy no older than 16 led a group of villagers armed with salvaged rifles and farming tools, using guerrilla tactics to pin down a scattered enemy patrol. In war-torn Canada, ex-military pilots scrambled old fighter jets, launching from broken highways turned into makeshift runways. In Nigeria, a rebel frequency broadcasted directions for liberated zones, mapping out safe corridors where humans could regroup and strike again. The resistance was not organized, but it was alive, and it was furious. The invaders tried to recover. Their systems, after briefly collapsing under the shard's pulse, were slowly sensing again, but the damage was done. The confidence that had once held their ranks together was shattered. Their formations were sloppier. Their commanders barked orders with hesitation. Fear had entered their equation. For the first time, they were uncertain. And that was all humanity needed. In a hidden bunker beneath the Siberian permafrost, the team that built the shard was already working on the next phase. They knew the pulse wouldn't be enough, not on its own. It was a crack in the wall, not the demolition. But they had learned something vital. The enemy's neural link wasn't just their power. It was their dependence. And now they had a weakness that could be exploited. So, said Mara, the leader of the shard engineers, leaning over a flickering holomap, we hit them again. Harder, but not everywhere at once. One of the engineers, a wiry man named Dax, nodded. Targeted strikes. Hit command hubs. Cut off their voices. And then, asked a younger girl who had joined only weeks earlier, a refugee with sharp eyes and quicker hands. Mara's face hardened. Then we send them a message. They are not welcome here. Elsewhere, within the ruins of the old Earth Space Command Center, now an enemy base, Commander Vale stood in silence. Reports flooded his desk. Units lost. Territory contested. Human attacks increasing exponentially. It wasn't just a few skirmishes anymore. It was an uprising. He couldn't understand it. They were scattered, he hissed. Defeated. Starving. Now they were everywhere. Appearing and vanishing like ghosts. Hitting fuel convoys. Hacking supply drones. Hijacking transport ships. This wasn't random. This was coordinated chaos. And somewhere in that chaos, he feared, was intelligence greater than they had expected. Not one mind, but many. That was what made humans dangerous. They didn't need a single voice. They were wild, individual, unpredictable. And in the ashes of defeat, they were more united than ever before. In an abandoned city once called Sao Paulo, resistance leaders met for the first time in person since the invasion began. Not through secure channels or encrypted messages, but in the open, around fires and digital maps displayed on broken skyscraper walls. They had hope now. And more than that, they had momentum. We strike the ships, one said. No, another countered. We strike their supply routes. Both, said the third. But we do it together. Everywhere. All at once. And so it began. The first global pushback. From deserts to tundras, from oceans to mountain ranges, the message spread faster than the invaders could intercept it. Codes disguised as music, coordinates hidden in children's rhymes, instructions embedded in graffiti on bombed-out walls. The language of rebellion was everywhere, and every human heart understood it. They attacked at dawn. In every time zone, resistance cells launched coordinated strikes. Fuel depots erupted in fire. Supply chains were hijacked. Ground troops were ambushed in alleyways. They moved with precision, not like a broken species, but like a sharpened blade. For the first time in the entire invasion, humanity had seized control of the narrative. And on the command ship, Vale watched in growing dread as red lights blinked across every continent. Why won't they stay down? He growled. Because he didn't understand. This wasn't just a planet to humans. This was home. And the people of Earth had been broken, scattered, nearly erased. But they were never tamed. No invader, no matter how advanced, could ever crush the will of a species that had climbed from caves, fought through ice ages, built empires from mud and steel, and looked up at the stars with defiance in their blood. In a cold bunker, Mara received a single encrypted message. Pulse signal successful. Retaliation escalating. Awaiting Phase 2 orders. She stared at the screen, then at the makeshift teams surrounding her, exhausted, bruised, but burning with purpose. "Phase 2, she whispered. Then louder, "Get ready." Because Earth wasn't just surviving anymore. It was fighting to win. A dense fog blanketed the remains of what was once Tokyo. Neon signs, now cracked and barely glowing, flickered like dying stars in the smog. Enemy patrol ships hummed quietly above the ruins, scanning the streets for heat signatures. Their sensors, once flawless, now glitched every few seconds, blinded by Earth's new wave of electronic interference. But beneath the silence, beneath the ashes and broken glass, something stirred. The resistance was no longer hiding. It was building, evolving, learning faster than anyone expected, even faster than the invaders could adapt. In the underground tunnels that once belonged to the city's metro system, a new kind of war room had formed. Young engineers, old scientists, soldiers, and scavengers all worked side by side. Maps lined the walls, real paper maps, immune to digital tampering. They marked enemy bases, ship crash sites, troop movements, and something new, symbols that represented victories. Small ones, perhaps. A stolen shipment, a liberated neighborhood, a downed patrol drone, but they were victories nonetheless. Each one mattered. At the center of it all was Kaido, a former AI systems analyst who once designed peacekeeping bots. Now he was repurposing alien tech, breaking into the enemy's own systems, line by line. His goal wasn't just to disrupt them anymore. It was to hijack them. With the help of a salvaged neural relay and parts pulled from downed enemy scouts, Kaido's team had successfully broken into a lower-tier enemy drone, a basic reconnaissance unit. They gave it new instructions, new purpose, and when it rose from the tunnel in the early morning fog, it flew straight into an enemy compound, pretending to be one of them. It worked. The invaders hadn't expected this kind of counterstrike. They understood brute force. They were prepared for desperate humans throwing rocks and bullets. But this was infiltration. Subtle, strategic, human. And worse for them, it was spreading. Around the globe, resistance groups had started forming their own tech units. They stripped enemy machines, hacked interfaces, and created hybrids. Drones with alien engines but human targeting. EMP weapons refined to target only invader tech. Even exosuits were being reprogrammed to fit human soldiers. The enemy's weapons were becoming humanity's tools. Commander Vale could no longer deny the truth. Control was slipping. Entire regions were marked unpredictable. Communications were increasingly unreliable. Ambush reports filled every channel. His elite squads, the ones designed to crush resistance in minutes, were being overrun in hours. "How are they adapting this fast?" he growled. "They are not adapting," replied one of his aides. "They are becoming something else." That thought disturbed him more than he wanted to admit, because it was true. Earth was no longer the same planet they had invaded. Humanity wasn't just resisting. They were transforming. Forced by war, shaped by desperation, sharpened by loss, they had become something far more dangerous than before. They were no longer just survivors. They were tacticians, engineers, shadow warriors, and they were unified. Across the Pacific, in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, Mara and her crew had successfully installed the second-generation Shard Pulse device, stronger, wider-reaching, and now with the ability to target specific command nodes. They called this version the Fang. Unlike the first Shard, which had broadcast a general disruption, the Fang could strike like a scalpel, cutting deep into enemy systems without affecting human infrastructure. Their first test, a strike on a command beacon hovering over the ruins of Rome. At precisely 300 hours, the Fang fired. Above Rome, the beacon blinked once, then exploded midair. Instantly, enemy units across southern Europe lost coordination. Ships dropped in altitude. Troops staggered, their minds disconnected from the command flow. And in that moment, Across hills and valleys, resistance forces surged forward. Ambushes triggered. Supply routes were cut. Entire garrisons were overwhelmed in minutes. The Fang had done more than disable their tech. It had humiliated them. Val's rage echoed through the halls of his ship. They are dismantling our empire, one shard at a time. But his officers didn't meet his eyes. They had begun to understand something their commander still resisted. They weren't fighting a broken race anymore. They were fighting a people who had learned to weaponize hope. Back in Tokyo, Kaido received the report from Rome with a grin. "We're getting good at this," said a nearby soldier. "No," Kaido replied, watching his hijacked drone return for another mission. "We're just getting started." And somewhere, on a signal that skipped through satellites, across oceans, and into secret tunnels around the world, the girl's voice returned. The same voice from weeks ago. Calm, steady, human. "We are rising." And this time, the invaders heard it too. Smoke curled above the shattered skyline of Berlin, rising like ghostly tendrils into a darkening sky. The last of the invader command beacons flickered on the horizon. Its sleek alien surface scorched, its stabilizers failing. All over the world, the beacons were falling. Systems were collapsing. Orders were being lost in translation. And the enemy, once precise and ruthless, now looked scattered, confused, mortal. In hidden bunkers and forest hideouts, in ruined cities and desert caves, humans watched the final phase begin. It was time. Not for survival, not for resistance, but for the reckoning. In the cold Arctic Circle, Mara stood before the activation panel of the Fang's final upgrade. Around her, survivors turned specialists worked tirelessly, rewiring ancient tech and salvaged alien cores. Some were former students, others were retired soldiers. Many were farmers and civilians turned warriors by necessity. Mara looked out at the ice fields beyond the cracked observation window. In the distance, a massive enemy structure, half ship, half tower, pierced the clouds. It had landed there weeks ago. It had seemed invincible then. Not anymore. She gave the nod. Activate. A low hum filled the room as the Fang pulsed once, twice, then screamed to life. A lance of invisible energy ripped through the sky, so focused and sharp that the clouds seemed to recoil. Within seconds, the enemy structure in the Arctic began to distort, its surface fracturing like shattered glass. It collapsed in on itself with a low, haunting roar and a burst of purple-blue light. A cheer rose in the control room. But Mara didn't smile. It wasn't over. Not yet. Across the Atlantic, Kaido stood atop a fallen enemy warship in the ruins of Chicago, watching as a dozen hijacked drones flew in perfect formation above him. Each carried one thing, a homemade bomb built from parts of the enemy's own tech. The plan was simple. Hit the remaining skyforts, the largest airborne command vessels still floating over Earth, and bring them down. This time, humanity wasn't attacking with desperation. This was precision. This was retribution. "Send the signal," Kaido ordered. Above him, the drones streaked into the sky, part of dozens of identical squadrons launched across the globe. In orbit, Commander Vale stared at a flickering holomap. Red lights now outnumbered green. Earth was no longer theirs. His generals were silent. His data feeds corrupted. The Hive's neural network, once flawless, had become a liability. It had made them fast, but predictable. Strong, but inflexible. One mind spread across many. Now, it was unraveling. And the humans, they were chaos incarnate. "We should retreat," one of his officers whispered. "Preserve what we can." Vale turned slowly. His expression was hollow. This was supposed to be a cleansing. "It has become our trial," the officer replied. In the high orbit above Earth, massive ships began to power down. Retreat codes were sent, but Earth wasn't letting them go without scars. Back in the Andes Mountains, a young girl, once a refugee, now a symbol of the movement, climbed onto a communications tower rigged with amplifiers. Her voice had traveled the world before. It would again. She didn't shout. She didn't command. She simply spoke. To the stars, we send our warning. The entire resistance fell silent to listen. We were not ready when you came. You took our skies. You burned our homes. You thought we would kneel. She paused, the wind brushing her face. You were wrong. At that moment, Kaido's drone squad hit the first skyfort. A massive explosion burst through the clouds, shaking the heavens. Moments later, another, then another. All across the globe, the sky lit with fire as the last of the invader ships fell. In orbit, Vale stood alone as his own bridge crew fled in escape pods. He watched Earth below, not as a prize, but as a warning. They had come to conquer, but they had awakened something deeper than he could understand. Not just strength, not just technology, but will. Earth wasn't just a planet. It was a soul with teeth. As his ship trembled under internal failure, Vale closed his eyes and whispered, "They will never be the same again." And he was right. When the last invader ship crashed into the Pacific, a stillness settled across the world. Not peace, not yet, but silence, the kind that comes after the storm, when breath returns and hearts realize they are still beating. In the months that followed, Earth rebuilt. Not like before. Better. Cities rose again, this time with walls not of fear, but of unity. The resistance became something more, a global council of survivors and thinkers, builders and dreamers. They didn't just want to restore what was lost. They wanted to reach beyond. They had touched the enemy's machines, learned from their systems, and grown stronger. Now they would use that knowledge not to invade, but to explore. And above it all, painted on the side of the first reborn launch ship, were the words, "We remember, we rise, we roar." Humanity had survived the storm, and now it was heading for the stars, with thunder in its blood.